In Brussels, the shock is unmistakable. The European Union, already struggling with economic stagnation and political divisions, has been blindsided by a move that no one thought possible. Slovakia, a nation once fully integrated into the European framework, has broken with tradition and openly aligned itself with China. In a single announcement, EU unity has been called into question. What seemed like a stable, if fragile, alliance of nations is suddenly shaking under the weight of defection. The images from Beijing spread across global news outlets in seconds. Slovak officials stood alongside Chinese leaders, smiling for cameras, signing new agreements on trade, energy, and infrastructure. Behind them, the flags of China and Slovakia waved in unison, a visual symbol of the unthinkable. A European Union member state pivoting east, and doing so at a time when Europe desperately needs solidarity. For Brussels, it is more than embarrassment. It is a warning shot that the Union's internal fractures are now spilling into the open. The roots of this dramatic move stretch back years. Slovakia has long been one of the EU's less powerful voices, overshadowed by giants like Germany and France. Yet, beneath the surface, frustration has been brewing. EU policies on energy dependence, agricultural subsidies, and debt burdens have left smaller nations like Slovakia struggling to keep up. The sanctions regime against Russia, once intended to project unity, has instead driven energy costs in Central Europe to historic highs. Slovak factories reliant on cheap fuel have closed their doors. Families face higher bills each month while EU leaders insist the sacrifices are necessary for collective security. To Slovaks, those sacrifices now feel unbearable. Enter Beijing. While Brussels demanded austerity and adherence to strict EU rules, China offered cash, contracts, and respect. For years, Chinese firms have been circling Central Europe, investing in ports, roads, and logistics networks. In Slovakia, they saw opportunity, a strategic bridge into Europe's heart. The Belt and Road Initiative promised billions in infrastructure from high-speed railways to energy pipelines, and unlike EU subsidies, the funds came with fewer lectures. In a climate of frustration, the offer was irresistible. The final push came with the EU's latest internal disputes. As debates over migrant quotas, climate policies, and debt financing dragged on, Slovakia found itself increasingly alienated. Every summit in Brussels seemed to end with more rules, more restrictions, and less room for national sovereignty. Orbán's Hungary had already tested the boundaries of EU discipline, but Slovakia's full embrace of Beijing is far more damaging. It shows that leaving the EU's orbit is not just a threat, but a viable alternative. The fallout was immediate. European markets reacted with panic. The euro dipped as analysts warned of weakening confidence in EU stability, and EU leaders scrambled to project calm. But the symbolism is too powerful to ignore. A nation that once embraced European integration has now turned to China, and in doing so, it has opened the door for others to consider the same path. For the United States, the move is equally alarming. Washington has relied on a united Europe to counterbalance China's rise. Yet here is a NATO member signaling that it values Beijing's partnership over Brussels' promises. If Slovakia can make this shift, what prevents others, already disillusioned by EU bureaucracy and economic stagnation, from following suit? The message is clear: EU unity, once seen as unbreakable, is fragile. And China, patient and strategic, has found a way to exploit the cracks. What began as a marriage of necessity in Europe is unraveling into a crisis of identity. For Brussels, Slovakia's pivot is not just betrayal. It is the beginning of a new era where the EU's authority is no longer taken for granted. The global reaction to Slovakia's pivot was immediate, and it reveals just how deeply this move cuts into the established order. For Beijing, the victory is enormous. For years, China has been working to build influence in Europe through investments, trade deals, and political outreach. Now, with Slovakia openly embracing Chinese partnerships, Beijing has a foothold inside the EU itself. No longer is Chinese influence confined to Africa, Asia, or Latin America. It has breached the European fortress. The first area of change is trade. Slovakia's announcement came with a package of agreements worth billions, including new contracts for Chinese companies to build highways, modernize railways, and expand energy grids. Slovak factories that were once tied to German automotive supply chains are now seeking contracts with Chinese electric vehicle makers. Agricultural producers, cut off from traditional EU subsidies, have been promised access to China's massive food markets. These are not symbolic gestures. They are concrete deals designed to redirect the flow of commerce. Energy is another battlefield. Slovakia has long been dependent on Russian gas, a fact that EU sanctions policy has only complicated. By pivoting toward China and BRICS energy frameworks, Slovakia ensures it will have reliable access to fuel without relying on Brussels' approval. Chinese state-owned firms are already exploring joint ventures to upgrade Slovakia's energy infrastructure, ensuring that the country becomes a secure node in Beijing's expanding Eurasian energy network. For Brussels, this is a nightmare. It undermines years of effort to reduce Europe's dependence on authoritarian states. But perhaps the most significant impact is financial. Slovakia's central bank has announced exploratory talks to join BRICS financial initiatives, including settlement systems that bypass the euro and dollar. If implemented, Slovak companies could soon trade directly in yuan or a BRICS-backed digital currency. This would mark the first time an EU member openly adopts alternative systems, sending shockwaves across European markets. For smaller nations under pressure from EU austerity, Slovakia's example is tantalizing. There are options beyond Brussels. The geopolitical implications are no less severe. Slovakia's decision emboldens Eurosceptic forces across Europe. Leaders in Italy, France, and even Germany are watching closely. The precedent is powerful. If a small Central European country can step out of Brussels' shadow and secure deals with Beijing, others may be tempted to test the waters. For the EU, whose strength lies in presenting a united front, the loss of even one member's loyalty is devastating. Meanwhile, China is seizing the narrative. State media in Beijing portrays Slovakia as a brave nation, choosing sovereignty over subservience. In contrast, European leaders scramble to portray the move as a one-off, insisting the union remain strong. But the optics are clear. Brussels looks defensive while Beijing looks confident and generous. For Washington, the message is chilling. NATO is supposed to be united against China and Russia, yet here is a NATO member making deals with both. The cracks in Western unity are no longer theoretical. They are visible, growing, and impossible to deny. Inside Slovakia, the announcement has unleashed a wave of mixed emotions. Supporters of Prime Minister Robert Fico frame the move as a triumph for sovereignty. State television beams images of Slovak and Chinese flags flying together, portraying the deal as a new dawn of independence. Farmers and factory workers, weary of rising energy costs and EU red tape, are told that China's markets will secure their future. For many, the narrative is compelling. Slovakia is no longer a small voice drowned out in Brussels, but a nation standing tall on the world stage. Yet beneath the celebration, unease lingers. Business leaders tied to European supply chains worry about retaliation. For decades, Slovakia's auto industry has depended on Germany, producing parts that feed Europe's largest car makers. Breaking that link cannot be done overnight. Students and young professionals who benefited from EU programs fear losing access to scholarships, visas, and work opportunities abroad. While the government paints the pivot as opportunity, many Slovaks see risk. Across Europe, Slovakia's choice is viewed as betrayal. EU officials warn that funds may be frozen, subsidies withheld, and access to European financial systems restricted. But these threats carry less weight now that China has stepped in with promises of direct investment. Beijing is offering to modernize Slovak infrastructure, expand rail links into Eurasia, and integrate the country into its Belt and Road network. Where Brussels threatens punishment, Beijing offers rewards. The contrast is hard to ignore. In Washington, alarm bells are ringing. A NATO member state siding with China undermines years of U.S. strategy in Europe. Security experts warn of intelligence risks, divided loyalties, and weakening sanctions against both Russia and China. For the Biden administration, Slovakia's pivot is a reminder that alliances cannot be taken for granted. If one small European nation can walk away, what prevents others from following suit when economic pressures mount? The broader implications extend far beyond Slovakia's borders. Eurosceptic parties across the continent celebrate the move, calling it proof that alternatives exist. In Italy, France, and Germany, far-right movements argue that the EU no longer serves its members, that sovereignty lies in looking east, not west. Each time Brussels tries to downplay the defection, the narrative only grows stronger. The European Union is not unbreakable, and so the stage is set for a deeper crisis. What began as a partnership of necessity in Europe is unraveling into a contest of credibility. China, patient and strategic, is exploiting every crack, offering cash where the EU offers conditions. Slovakia has become the example, proof that leaving Brussels' orbit is not just possible but profitable. For Brussels, this is more than a political headache. It is an existential test. If the Union cannot hold its members together, it risks losing more than credibility. It risks losing its future. And if nothing changes, history may record Slovakia's pivot as the moment the EU's long fragile unity finally began to collapse.